Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Paul Harris. He is Victor S. Thomas Professor of Education at the Graduate School of Education at Harvard University. And today we're going to focus on his most recent book, Child Psychology in 12 Questions. So, Dr. Harris, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to everyone.
Thank you.
So let me first ask you, before we get into some of those 12 questions you explore in the book regarding child psychology. So how old is developmental psychology, and what are some of its goals? I mean, what are its objects of study here?
So roughly speaking, I would say it's about a century old, initiated in the late 19th century. Mostly at that point by gentlemen scholars keeping notes on their child or their sister's child. I suppose experimental work or more systematic work covering, a sample of children rather than targeted children began in the early 20th century. And of course, it depends a little bit whether we're talking about Russia, Europe, the United Kingdom, or the United States. The trajectory was slightly different across those different places. But I would say developmental psychology began then to become, so to speak, rooted, institutionalized in university settings in the 1920s, and two key figures that had a big influence, long-term influence, would be Vygotsky in Russia and Jean Piaget in Switzerland. Well, and then, of course, we could spend the next hour talking about what happened in the following century, but that would be quite time-consuming. Yeah.
Sure, and we will cover a little bit of that anyways going through the questions. So one of the topics that you cover in your book is attachment theory. So what is this about? How was it first developed? And does it apply just to children in this case, or also to adults?
So the main theorist and writer about attachment was John Bowlby, a British psychiatrist, whose interest was triggered in the consequences of being separated or having a unloving family in childhood, both when he was for a short time a teacher in a school for children with emotional difficulties, and then subsequently, following the Second World War, when he was asked by the WHO to review the consequences of children becoming orphaned or spending time in camps or being displaced from their home. And to simplify the theory at first, it was sort of almost a medical metaphor that Bowlby used, that just as children need physical nutrients, so they need psychological nutrients. And of that, the most important is a loving relationship with a parent or parents, where the parent is in some sense consistently available and reliable. He then explored that claim in a more ethological context, looking at other species. He re-examined some of his early assumptions based on psychoanalytic theory in the light of his own development and research. And so those were the early days, and the theory somewhat impressively continues to guide research in a variety of domains within developmental psychology. Yeah.
And what different kinds of attachment are there?
So early on, Bowlby tended to classify attachment in terms of, if you like, satisfactory and unsatisfactory, but he collaborated with an American investigator, Mary Ainsworth, who argued that once you put aside, so to speak, gross deprivation or gross long-term separation, and focus on the normal range of parenting that children are exposed to, it's plausible to identify three different patterns. On the one hand, there's a consistently available parent who fosters a secure attachment. Mm-hmm. Then there's a more or less consistently unavailable parent who leads to a sort of avoidant or detachment on the part of the child. And then there are parents who, for whatever reason, be it other burdens in their life or other difficulties, are somewhat inconsistent. And for their children, it's difficult to anticipate whether the parent will be available or not. And so those children tend to end up having a so-called ambivalent relationship. The other contribution that Ainsworth made was to create a small, if you like, laboratory probe, which came to be known as the strange situation, where, in a nutshell, the child was briefly separated from their mother and left for a short time either with the stranger or on their own. And observers noted how they responded to the mother's departure, how they responded to the mother's return, and classified them into these three distinct groups on the basis of their more fine-grained behavior. And then I guess I should add one footnote, well, not exactly a footnote, but an important addition, which was that in due course, it was acknowledged that some babies or infants didn't really fall into any of these three classifications. They were hard to adjudicate, so to speak. And eventually, a fourth classification, the so-called disorganized infant, was in some sense created or identified. And they're characterized by vacillatory behavior. In some sense, they themselves are difficult to pin down as having a consistent strategy. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And have these kinds of attachment been replicated cross-culturally, or do they apply mostly to Western societies, for example?
So I would say there's an ongoing debate in developmental psychology about the extent to which this theory is a universal theory or it's about Western modes of upbringing. Mm-hmm. The more, if we like, the more, what can we say, classically trained developmental psychologist taking a more quantitative perspective, I think would insist that when you do these kinds of tests, particularly the test, the strange situation that Mary Ainsworth devised, you see broadly similar distribution of children in all sorts of different cultures. At the same time, there are more anthropologically oriented psychologists who feel that the emphasis on the child's, in some sense, increasing independence along with attachment is a misrepresentation of the goals and values of certain cultures where interdependence perhaps is emphasized throughout the lifetime. Well, yeah, that's, as I say, an ongoing debate with different groups in developmental writing and counter-writing.
Mm-hmm. Right. So another question would be, what are the psychological effects of extreme deprivation on children, and what does extreme deprivation really mean?
Well, of course, in some ways, Bowlby himself was interested in extreme deprivation when he studied children suffering during the Second World War. Mm-hmm. But sadly, another opportunity came for researchers to put that situation under the microscope following the downfall of the Ceausescu regime in Romania, when many infants were discovered housed in very poorly under very poor conditions in government-run orphanages.
Right.
Poorly run in the sense that the children never had a stable caregiver. There was a sort of rota of caregivers, so they didn't have the opportunity, the children, to form a stable relationship. And the children were getting relatively minimal physical care, but not the kind of affection and love that Bowlby had emphasized. So many of those children were eventually removed from the orphanages and adopted in various Western countries. And so we've been able to study the development of those children and the extent to which staying in the orphanage in the early years for 6 months or 2 years, depending on the particular case, led to long-term consequences. And I think the evidence suggests that on the one hand, adoption into a loving home is very, very beneficial. But it also shows that adoption into a loving home won't necessarily, as it were, put an end to the psychological difficulties that have been set in motion by this very deprived experience. And so what we see among children who've been through those Romanian orphanages often is a difficulty in establishing an attachment, a tendency to be indiscriminately approaching both familiar people and strangers as if there were no difference. So in other words, the kind of selectivity that you see in a normal child seems to have been overridden. I'm tempted to say that is one of the most obvious long-term difficulties. And it's not true of every single child who went through a Romanian orphanage, and we're not quite sure why it is found in some rather than others, but it's almost certain that it's more prevalent among those groups of children who've been through such experiences than it would be in the normal population.
Mm-hmm. And of course, another topic that you cover on the book and people are very interesting about when it comes to child development has to do with vocabulary and language comprehension. So, and we find, of course, individual differences there. But do we know where these individual differences stem from? Is it, for example, genetic factors? Is it environmental factors or something else?
So I think the answer depends a little bit on who you talk to. On the one hand, if you look at researchers interested in early childhood education and the promotion of a child's readiness to thrive in the school setting, in the preschool setting, you'll find researchers emphasizing quite a lot the linguistic environment that the child is growing up in particular, the extent to which the child has a caregiver who enjoys talking to the child, often enters into connected conversation where a thread, a particular topic is followed. And that has led to efforts to help provide support for parents to offer that kind of linguistic environment, encouraging them to think about the possibility that language is not just an organ that grows spontaneously. It's a skill that can be nourished by linguistic input from the surrounding family. So on the one hand, then, there is pretty good evidence that from a variety of studies that children exposed to this kind of rich linguistic environment will end up acquiring new words more successfully, and therefore, in that respect, be better suited for schooling. But there's another group of researchers who emphasize the extent to which there may be a genetic link between biological parents and their children, and various kinds of study using the methods of behavioral genetics have argued that indeed the similarity in the sort of language profile of a parent and their biological offspring is something that becomes increasingly obvious when you study the child later. So if you ask about the similarity between an adolescent and their parent, the evidence seemed to suggest that, if anything, the genes are more important than the environment. So, I mean, to put it in simple terms, if we're looking at a child, going back to children who were adopted, there won't be much similarity between the breadth of the child's vocabulary as an adolescent and the breadth of the vocabulary of their adoptive parent. On the other hand, there will be a similarity between the breadth of the adolescent's vocabulary and the breadth of their biological parent, even if the biological parent wasn't there to raise the child. So there's a bit of a paradox here in the sense that the environment seems to be dominating the variation among younger children, whereas genes or genetic factors seem to be increasingly important as the child gets older.
And do we know why that happens? Why it is that inter-individual variation, the amount of inter-individual variation seems attributable to genetic factors seems to increase as children get older? Do we have any idea why that happens?
I would say right now we just have speculative hypotheses. I mean, one possibility is that as children get older, their own internal abilities and dispositions enable them to seek out a more linguistically rich environment, whether it's by going to the library or reading a lot. So in other words, the 3-year-old, their linguistic environment is not up to them. It's determined by the family in which they're growing up. But as children get older, they may or may not choose to expose themselves to a more linguistically rich environment. So that's one line of explanation. Yeah.
And still regarding language, what kinds of questions do children ask? And does that tell us anything about the information they are interested in, that they pay attention to, and that they would, I suppose, naturally seek out for?
So, yes, we've learned quite a lot about children's questions in the last decade or so, I would say. So traditionally, if we go back to people like Piaget, there was a tendency to think of children's questions as reflecting their particular perspective on the world. So he argued that they tend to ask questions about the purpose of an object, as if everything had a purpose. But in fact, his data gathering was rather restricted. And more recently, we've learned a lot from the systematic tape recording of young children, often at home with their caregiver, in the context of studying language acquisition. And within those conversations, of course, we can identify where the child is asking a question, how the parent responds. So question asking, it turns out, begins quite early, from 18 months even. And then at that young age, between, let's say, 18 and 30 months, the child is asking lots of what questions, lots of where questions. By the age of 30 months, you see a new development where the child begins to ask how and why questions, asking for explanations. And I've been interested in this line of research partly because I think it shows that children, in some sense, are, what can we say, they're gifted pupils who realize that their knowledge is limited, but also realize that there may be lots of information that they can gather from other people. And the information, for the most part, is something that they will take in and trust, sometimes perhaps query as well. And so you do also see children sometimes asking a question, receiving an answer, which for them is puzzling or disconcerting. And then they ask more questions to try to clarify what they have just been told. I guess one other dimension I would add is that quite a lot of children's questions are, if you like, what can we say, fairly practical. You know, where are my socks? But there are increasingly, as children get older, but even at a fairly young age, 3, 4, 5 years of age, children begin to ask what we might think of as more existential questions about origins, differences between the genders, how babies are made, what happens to us when we die, and so forth. And if you look at the transcripts, parents are sometimes a little bit nonplussed. They have some difficulty in knowing how best to answer these relatively probing questions that children are asking at a young age. Yeah.
And it's interesting that you mentioned there that many times children ask very practical questions, because there's this common idea that the children live in a sort of fantasy world. But is that really true?
I would say it is and it isn't. So on the one hand, it's true that children can temporarily live in a fantasy world, in the sense that from about 18 months, they start to engage in pretend play. As they become a little bit older, 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds, not only do they produce pretend actions, but they can collaborate with a sibling or a mother and create little episodes of pretend play. And I would be tempted to say that, you know, children often become absorbed in that pretend world in much the same way that you and I might be absorbed in a good novel. Right. We enjoy being in this, as it were, fictional world. But I think we can sometimes I think that tendency is misinterpreted. So by observers of children, people sometimes draw the conclusion that children almost live in a fantasy world without realizing it, or that the world that they think about is very exotic or fantastical. And I think that's wrong. Even when you look at children's pretend play, most of it is fairly realistic. In other words, it's mostly to do with routines of everyday life. You know, putting pretend food into a pot, or putting pretend tea into a cup, handing the cup to another child, and so a tea party is created. Or, you know, pretending to be a train driver by creating a train out of some cushions. So, in other words, the kind of media that young children, especially in the West, are exposed to, which often has talking animals, superheroes, and so forth. I think this is being handed to children, but it's not, they may be receptive, but it's not something that figures naturally in their own imagination. And if it starts to, it's probably due to the fact that they've been given a steady diet of cartoons or superhero stories, rather than something that they would naturally do themselves. And I say this partly based on cross-cultural work, which has studied children, as it were, outside of the Western world, where they also, of course, engage in pretend play, but it tends to be an echo, a reconstruction of the everyday activities that they see around them, often the work activities of the surrounding adults. Yeah.
And cognitively speaking, do you think it makes sense to separate things like pretend play, imagination, and fantasy from concrete and rational thinking? Does that distinction make sense or not?
I would argue against it. So traditionally, I suppose those two tendencies, let's call them the imaginative on the one hand and the rational on the other, they have been placed in opposition. Mm-hmm. So if we go back to Freud, Freud tended to think that on the one hand there is sort of free association and fantasy, and on the other hand there is more ego-regulated objective thinking. And to some extent even Piaget in his early days adopted that dichotomy. I don't think that's right, for the reason that much of our thinking, even about reality, depends on our ability to think about alternatives, to think about how things might have been, or indeed, when we're engaged in planning, to think about how things might be if we take this job, if we retire at the age of 65 or postpone it by a few years, if we decide to have yet another child. These scenarios, we can't, as it were, rationally think them through without using our imagination. And I would say then, in the case of human cognition, there's a very deep, persistent, lifelong connection between everyday thinking, everyday planning, and the imagination.
But do children easily confuse fantasy with reality? Is that something that really happens, or not so much?
I would say not so much. So let's take a clear-cut case where the temptation to confuse the two might be most obvious. So quite a few children, aged 3, 4, 5, will invent an imaginary companion. And they want this imaginary companion to be given a seat at the dinner table. When the family leaves the house, they might be worried and turn the television on for the imaginary companion so that it's not lonely. So in some sense, they treat this companion as if it were real. But when you interview these children about the status of their imaginary companion, there's no indication that they've decided this person is a real person. And there have been occasional rather charming interventions by the child being interviewed to remind the interviewer not to get into a muddle. This is just a pretend friend. It's not a real friend. So I think that, I've given you one example, but I think that's a more informative example of the general area of make-believe fiction. Children are pretty clear about the boundaries between the two. Having said that, of course, it may be that something that the child reads or something that the child is told may lead them to expect it to be true of reality. But that's more to do with, a lack of information than any, as it were, epistemic difficulty in distinguishing the make-believe world from the real world. So, a very straightforward case is Santa Claus. Young children believe in Santa Claus. But that's not because they're confused about fantasy and reality. It's because the parents create a world which points to the evidence of the existence of Santa Claus. There's quite a bit of evidence that he does exist, thanks to parents' machinations. As I say, I think that's if the children are muddled about that, it's because the evidence has been doctored. It's not because they lack the ability to make a distinction between what is fantastical and what is real.
Mm-hmm. Can we say that children are natural psychologists? That is, the capacity to attributing desires, beliefs, intentions to other people. Is it something that comes naturally to children, or does it have to be taught in some way?
I would say it does come naturally, but of course, I wouldn't want to say that the whole set of concepts for engaging in psychological thinking about people is there in a newborn baby. So we have plenty of evidence that this is a slowly constructed set of concepts, which we see becoming more rich and more elaborate from birth onwards. So if anything, we might say that this is one area where the sort of Piagetian vision of the child, starting off with a simple concept and then elaborating upon it and building a more complicated edifice, has proven a good way to think about the child's development. So natural, yes, but nonetheless relying on the child's own reflection and engagement. Having said that, there are certain experiences which we know to be especially important for children to be successful in this enterprise. Perhaps one of the most obvious is being exposed to language and conversation. So there's an interesting comparison that's been made between two groups of deaf children. Some deaf children are born to deaf parents, and their deaf parents have sign language often at their disposal, and their children acquire sign language roughly according to the same timetable as oral language, and their so-called understanding of mental states, their theory of mind development, is roughly the same as that of any typically developing child. But there's another group of deaf children who are born to hearing parents who, for obvious reasons, will not be equipped with sign language, may try to acquire it as adults, but will probably struggle. So for months, if not years, that particular deaf child is faced with a gap, a lack of opportunity to engage in communication. And there are various things to be said about how they try to deal with that, these children. But we do know that one consequence of that lack is that the child's understanding of mental states is considerably slower than that of a typically developing child. And I think on reflection, these results make sense because language is perhaps the most, or conversation is probably one of the most obvious activities where we're constantly thinking about what the other person knows and doesn't know, what the other person wants and doesn't want. So it's a kind of tutorial, if you like, in everyday psychology, if you have a conversation with somebody and their desires and their beliefs and their knowledge are perfectly the same as yours, well, you might as well stop talking to them because there's not much to discuss. On the other hand, when there are some gaps, as there certainly are between typically the 2-year-old or the 3-year-old and their parents, or between the 3-year-old child and the 5-year-old sibling, there's plenty to discuss because there's a good deal of divergence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I would like to ask you now a little bit about children's memory. So I think that as far as we know, most people do not remember anything at all or very little from their first few years of life, usually their first 3 years of life or so. Do we know why that's the case? Why something like infantile amnesia occurs?
I don't think we know for certain, but we do have some plausible ideas. And one of the most prominent ideas that a great deal of our biographical recall depends upon while we tend to think of it as a private activity, a lot of our recollections are in the context of everyday conversation. A 3-year-old discusses with their mother the fact that the day before they went to the zoo and they discuss, excuse me, what happened. So Catherine Nelson, who was one of the leading investigators of biographical memory, argues that children in the context of these conversations gradually are equipped with the tools to, as it were, explore their own memories, to come up with a coherent set of events. And they're equipped to do that because at first the parent, their conversation partner, provides a helpful scaffold, provides cues and reminders and asks questions. And indeed, there's a good deal of evidence that children whose parents engage in so-called elaborative reminiscing, where they provide lots of these supports and cues, those children may end up with richer biographical memories than children whose parents tend to think of it more as a kind of quiz or question and answer routine where they don't necessarily offer much support to the child. Mm-hmm. So, in a word, then, biographical memory becomes something more individualized, but it looks as if it starts as a joint activity.
And can we say that children's memories are reliable, or, I mean, are they more unreliable than the memories of adults or not?
I think they probably are more unreliable, but I think psychologists would emphasize the fact that young children and adults' memories are not very reliable. And it's partly due to the very fact that the facts that I've just emphasized, that on the one hand, reminiscing about an event can be helpful because your conversation partner asks you a question about what happened. But the difficulty is that sometimes your conversational partner won't ask you a neutral question, but a more leading question. They might say, weren't you upset when such and such happened? And the danger is that these so-called leading questions may prompt you to think back and dwell on one or two signs that, well, indeed, maybe you were upset. And even with repeated questioning about an episode that never took place, there's evidence that some children and indeed adults may end up believing that these episodes did actually take place. So a completely fictitious or non-existent episode can be, so to speak, planted in somebody's memory by virtue of repetitious questioning. And, you know, in forensic settings, when children or adults are being interviewed by a social worker or a member of the police force, very often these interviews are repetitious, and they may include, even with the best will in the world, they may include some questions that are leading, and to that extent somewhat misleading. So all of us, I think, are vulnerable to this so-called false memory syndrome, or the misremembering. We tend to end up thinking that we participated in certain events, or certain events happened to us, when in fact the basis for our memory is something that we've been told rather than something that we actually experienced.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to children's emotional development, how is it that they come to develop an understanding of emotion, their own emotions and the emotions of other people? Is that something that they are also somewhat predisposed to, or is it learned in any way?
Well, the question you're asking goes all the way back to Darwin. So I mentioned that in the second part of the 19th century, there were these gentlemen scientists who were studying their own children, and Darwin is an example. And in fact, he was quite interested in the facial expressions that his son, Doddy, produced. And he was also interested in the facial expressions that he thought his son could understand and interpret appropriately. Well, zooming forward to the middle of the 20th century, there was a lot of work, primarily inspired by Paul Ekman, a US psychologist, arguing that some simple emotions, happiness, fear, anger, disgust, surprise, sadness, in all cultures come with a particular facial expression. And in Darwin's proposal was that babies are quite, what can we say, quite receptive and even quite competent from an early age at interpreting such facial expressions. In any case, whether they can do it in infancy, there's been a lot of work by developmental psychologists studying the extent to which, if we tell a child a certain situation, we give them a little story or vignette, and then we give them an array of facial expressions, can the child pick out the facial expression which is likely to depict the feelings of the protagonist in the story, given that he's met a fierce dog or he's going to the circus for the first time or whatever. My own interest in this work, though, has been about the extent to which children's understanding of emotion surely goes beyond this very basic set. So, for example, when we talk about being disappointed or relieved, it's not as if there's a particular facial expression which identifies somebody who's relieved as opposed to happy. We need to know a good deal more about the background circumstances, the situation that they've been facing, what they expected to happen, what didn't happen, and so forth. So in that sense, I would argue that children's understanding of emotion is much richer than this rather basic and simple decoding of facial expressions. It's also being sensitive to the kind of situations which people might be in, which might be different from their own situation, but to which people bring their desires and their hopes and their beliefs and so forth. So I think what we see then, and there's quite a lot of evidence showing this, that as children get older, they get better and better at realizing that how somebody feels depends upon the way in which that particular person appraises that particular situation. It depends on their background history. And to that extent, sympathy and emotional empathy depends upon not just sensitivity to nonverbal signs of emotion, but to a more biographical sensitivity. Yeah.
So getting a little bit into morality now, do children have an innate moral compass?
Well, there in the last 10, 15 years, there have been a lot of experiments with babies. The baby watches a certain mini video or cartoon where one person is kind and the other person is unhelpful or even nasty. And then the child might be given the opportunity to interact with these puppets that they just saw in the video. And the question is, to what extent do they show signs of preferring nice people to nasty people? And to cut a long story short, it looks as if they do. On the other hand, preferring nice people to nasty people is not, strictly speaking, a moral judgment. And so it's hard to know exactly what the relationship is between this early interpersonal sensitivity and moral judgment. I guess clear signs of moral thinking are easier to diagnose when you can talk to the child, when the child is 3 or 4. And at that point, children do seem to be pretty good at realizing that there are some fundamental moral principles. So, for example, they make claims like it's bad to hurt people, it's bad to take their things, and even if you discuss with them the possibility of a school where you wouldn't get punished for hurting somebody and you wouldn't get punished for stealing their things, children somewhat surprisingly insist that no, even then it would be wrong to do those things. So it's as if they have already internalized some kind of inner moral compass which says what is wrong and what is right, no matter what the rules and regulations are.
And are children able to make independent moral judgments, or are they always guided by the judgments of other people?
So I think I can offer you one interesting example of where children seem to be clearly making their own judgment. So some of us may know these children, or we've seen videos of these children. They're children who decide they don't want to eat meat. So they're growing up in a typically carnivorous family. And at a certain point, they announce that they don't want to eat meat. So in collaboration with a doctoral student, Karen Hazar, we interviewed some of these young children who were approximately between 6 and 12 years of age. And what came through for us was the fact that when we asked children about their preferences, their eating preferences, they were very much focused on the welfare of animals. So they said they didn't want to eat meat because they knew how animals were raised in factory farms. There was little evidence that they didn't eat meat because of matters of taste. So it wasn't that they were not eating meat because they didn't like the taste. On the other hand, if you spoke to ordinary children, ordinary in the sense of typical meat-eating children, they would talk about the fact that there were some kinds of meat that they didn't like to eat, but it wasn't anything to do with animal welfare. It was because the meat was it didn't taste good, or it had some fat in it, or whatever. So I think this is a nice example of where some children, of course, we're talking about a minority of children, are doing something which seems to be based on moral thinking, but we can't attribute it to their parents. If anything, their parents may find it somewhat complicated to cater to this this moral independence. Yeah.
And I mean, not just about moral judgments, but about judgments in general. Do children usually trust adults, or are there instances where they do not?
Well, I think this is the topic of trust is a big topic.
Yeah.
There are many areas of life where not just morality, but religion, science, where we as individuals are probably influenced by what other people think. Mm-hmm. And I would say that's true for children, and it's broadly true also for adults. So I would be tempted to say that we're inclined to overestimate the degree to which we make our own minds up in an autonomous fashion. And so, I mean, to give some quick examples, we adults and also children tend to think that psychological processes depend on the existence of a brain. But it's not as if most of us have never done any neuroscience research to check that out. We just take it for true. Equally, we accept that the world is round, or the earth is round. But again, it's mostly because we've been informed about that. It's not because we go and check the scientists who established that particular claim. So on the one hand, in the domain of science, I think we're quite dependent upon other people's beliefs. But equally, if we look at the demographic data, most people's religious convictions, the strongest predictor of their religious convictions is the family of origin, the family in which they grew up. So here's another example where their beliefs about God, about the afterlife, human origins, are very much dependent upon what they've been told and the extent to which they trust what they've told. Of course, that's not true for many people. Many people may eventually resist, change their minds, and so forth. But nonetheless, I think there are important parallels that we sometimes overlook between science and religion, in the sense that in both domains, we often do not have the capacity to sort these questions out for ourselves. I guess a recent example would be the pandemic, where it's not as if we could go and do our own research on the COVID virus, and we didn't know what the best medical practices were. We didn't know the extent to which it was helpful to wear masks or not helpful to wear masks. We didn't know about the potential efficacy of vaccines. So for the past 3 years, we've been scanning the media environment, and of course, there's a lot to be said about how we choose our media environment, but nevertheless, all of us, or the vast majority of us, are making decisions not on the strength of our private cogitation or experimentation, but upon a more or less judicious selection among competing messages.
Right. And you mentioned religion and supernatural beliefs at a certain point there. So I would like to ask you, as a developmental psychologist, what you think about this question that is very contentious, for example, among cognitive scientists of religion. So are children innately predisposed to believing in God and other supernatural entities or not?
My answer would be no. It's true that there are a fair number of cognitive scientists, some with a more anthropological persuasion, some with a more straightforward cognitive science persuasion, who are inclined to see children, as it were, as being predisposed to a belief in some kind of omnipotent being. From my own work, I would say that if anything, I'm more impressed by the extent to which, faced with all sorts of puzzles or unexpected outcomes, children's natural inclination is not to invoke a supernatural account, but a naturalistic account. And so there's a variety of studies that have, in some ways, reinforced that conclusion by presenting children with hard to explain phenomena. But when you ask the child how it happened, children will typically have recourse to an explanation that is appropriate in the sense that it's a physical explanation if it's a physical phenomenon, a biological explanation if it's a biological phenomenon, but it doesn't have any obvious connection to supernatural thinking. That said, I think there are, just as there are for us adults, there are for children major existential questions about ultimate origins and ultimate destiny, which are not easily answered, and where maybe children will sometimes struggle and may perhaps explore the possibility that, by analogy, just as many items in their environment were created by a human agent, maybe the larger environment was created by a supernatural agent. But I don't think that tendency should be seen as anything more than children showing some kind of understandable puzzlement, the kind of puzzlement we all feel as adults. I don't think it's a strong, pervasive tendency to create supernatural beliefs. But then, of course, as I was saying earlier, those questions may be answered much more firmly, for better or for worse, by the surrounding culture. The child may be being raised in a firmly Catholic environment, or a firmly secular environment, or a firmly Islam environment, and the likelihood is that the child will come to endorse those surrounding beliefs. So, if anything, I think what religions capitalize on is the human tendency to be trusting. But of course, the scientific enterprise capitalizes on the same tendency in promulgating its findings. So in that sense, I think you could as well argue that there's a natural inclination on the part of the child to believe in scientific explanations as in supernatural explanations. But at least at first, what they don't do when left to their own devices is, for the most part, they come up with naturalistic explanations, not necessarily correct ones, but not supernatural ones.
And regarding some of those questions of ultimate destiny, as you put it, do children have an understanding of death to any extent?
The answer, I think, falls into two parts. So on the one hand, there's quite a lot of evidence that as they get older, just as they understand emotion, as we were talking earlier, in a more constructive fashion, they build a more elaborate understanding. Mm-hmm. So I think they also build a more elaborate biological understanding of death as a biological fact. So they increasingly realize that death is inevitable. It's something that you can't reverse. And they increasingly make sense of it in terms of what's happening inside the body, in terms of the interconnection of the organs and so forth. And, between the ages of, it's a broad age range, but between 4 and 10, children will increasingly master this biological story. But alongside that, and unanswered by the biological story in a way is, well, that's all very well, but what happens to the person's soul or spirit or individuality? And there, children, I think, just as I was saying before, will receive guidance from the surrounding community. And they will, for better or for worse, start to believe that death is followed by nothing, or death is followed by the opportunity to go to heaven, or death is followed by the opportunity or the risk of going to hell, or death is followed by the possibility of turning into a mischievous ancestor. We know that there are various ways in which cultures conceptualize the afterlife. So what we see, I think, in the course of child development is these two narratives. On the one hand, the biological, and on the other hand, the more spiritual or afterlife narrative, gradually developing side by side. In the end, I don't see, from the work I've done, I don't think children show much of a tension between these two. In other words, you can have a child give you rather clear-cut answers about why this person died, and now what has happened to their ability to see and remember. If you tell them a more medical or biological story, but if you shift the context and talk about, well, now this elderly person is being buried, and there's a funeral service, and he or she is surrounded by the family, and you ask the children, what's happened to this elderly person now? Well, they shift away from the biological and they give you the more local afterlife narrative about the person going to heaven or whatever it may be.
Mm-hmm. So I have a final couple of questions to ask you about how cross-culturally variable is child psychology, and if there are any universals. So starting with the first one, what do we know about how child psychology varies cross-culturally, and are there, for example, particular domains or aspects of child psychology that we should expect to vary more cross-culturally, for example?
So I think I should preface my answer by saying that, going back to the beginning of our conversation, I think it's fair to say that child psychology has been, especially in the 20th century, predominantly a Western enterprise, and perhaps increasingly we might say also an English-speaking enterprise. That's not completely true, of course, because there are major exceptions to that. But if we talk about the number of personnel, the influence of particular journals, then Western and frequently English speaking is a reasonable characterization. So that means that quite a lot of what we've learned is vulnerable to criticism by virtue of the fact that we tend to think that what we find in Michigan is going to be the same as what we find in Mexico or Myanmar. And few of us have done research in Mexico or Myanmar to know whether that's true or not. I think the good news is that developmental psychologists are increasingly worrying about this problem. It's also the case that in other parts of the globe, we see psychological science becoming better supported. Training is improving. We see colleagues from China, from Turkey, publishing their findings, joining in, a relatively international enterprise. So I'm hopeful that as time goes on, we'll have a clearer picture about the kind of conceptual developments which are pretty stable across culture, and the kinds of conceptual developments which vary fairly dramatically. So, maybe it would be helpful to give a couple of examples from what I've already talked about.
Mm-hmm.
I'm tempted to think that when it comes to making sense of people's emotions, and here I'm going against, I think, the thrust of a lot of work in contemporary emotion research, which has become more culturally sensitive and more relativistic. My own thinking is that actually children in all sorts of different places build a relatively similar understanding of emotion. So as they get older, they increasingly realize that, for example, people won't necessarily express overtly what they actually feel. As they get older, they increasingly realize that people's emotions are not determined by the objective situation that the person is in, but by the way that the person appraises that situation. So these are, to my mind, quite important conceptual insights. And those conceptual insights, I think, there's good evidence that they're achieved by children in a wide range of cultural settings. So there's one example of where I think, contrary to what some people might think, we can reasonably expect children to travel along approximately the same road, so to speak, and reach the same destination. Even if, having said that, some of the experiences and some of the nuance may be somewhat different depending upon which culture they're in. On the other hand, if we turn to what we've just discussed, conceptions of the afterlife, well, I think it's pretty clear that because our notions of the afterlife are not constrained by human activity, it's not as if we go and visit the afterlife and see it being played out in one way, in one area of the world and played out in another way in another area of the world. We simply don't know much about the afterlife, so to speak. We rely on what other people tell us. And what other people tell us is pretty variable from one culture to the next. And so even if, with respect to death, most children will acquire a similar biological understanding, I think the way in which they acquire afterlife beliefs and the extent to which those afterlife beliefs are comforting, disturbing, is going to vary dramatically from one culture to another. And that's, I suppose, just one example among many, but an important one of where we're unlikely to see children moving in the same direction. Where they end up depends very much on history and teaching of their culture.
But then, if I understand it correctly, at this point in time, and since psychology has been focused so much on Western societies, it's not really possible for us to have a complete picture of what might be universal or variable in child psychology or psychology in general, for that matter, cross-culturally, correct?
Agreed. Yeah. I mean, we just have to wait and see. But I think I don't want to be too negative, because I think the good news is, as I say, that there's an increasing awareness of the problem, and there's an increasing building of a more internationally communicating, collaborating community of developmental scholars.
Okay, great. So I think this is a good point to end on. The book is again Child Psychology in 12 Questions. I will be leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview. Dr. Harris, just before we go, apart from the book, are there any places on the internet where people can find you or your work?
Yes, so if they go to my place of work, the Harvard Graduate School of Education, is the Harvard Graduate School of Education, as it were, faculty listing. And at that location, they can find a link to my own more personal website, which has some postings. I'm less conscientious than I should be by keeping it up to date, but at any rate, it's yeah. And the other thing I would say, you've hinted at it already, is that this book is the most recent, and there are other books that touch on the themes that we've mentioned, including emotion, imagination, and trust. And the usual suspect websites will provide information about those books as well.
Okay, so I will also be leaving links to your university page, your website, and your books, so in the description box. And Dr. Harris, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show, and it's been a great pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Ricardo. Keep up with the good work.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing and to keep the channel sustainable, please consider supporting it on Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description box of this interview. And if you like this interview, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check the website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litzkan, Blanchett Perga, Larson, Jerry Mueller, Hans Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Herbert Gintis, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Visser, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Henry Kalenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Jorge Pinha, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andrea, Francis Forte, Tiago Nunes, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Harl Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacil Ades Araújo, Romain Roches, Diego Londonio Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pablo Stazewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litska, Scott Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Morton Eichland, Dr. Bird, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Mau Maria, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Ruth Towell, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amaury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Pedro Bonilla, Ziegler, João Barbosa, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Herringman, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassis, Tom Roth, DRPMD, and Igor N. And special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Staffinia, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Hughney, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis, and Alni Ortiz, and to my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.